Useless. My father spat the word across the Christmas turkey, his voice cutting through the holiday music playing softly in the background. My stepmother Victoria scoffed, swirling her expensive red wine. Your sister Harper makes $50,000 a month as a CEO, Chloe. Maybe you should take notes instead of pretending you know how to run a business. The whole table erupted in laughter. 24 guests, a mix of cousins, corporate sycophants, and socialites, all waiting for me to break. They expected me to lower my head. They expected the 20-year-old girl they threw out into the snow nearly 2 decades ago. I did not cry. I simply adjusted my napkin, looked right at the golden child of the family, and said in a flat, cold voice, "That is impressive. But starting Monday, her pay drops to $20,000, or she is fired. Her choice." The laughter died instantly. Before I show you exactly how I dismantled my toxic family's empire piece by piece, hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to build your own table because your family refused you a seat. The dining room went so silent you could hear the grand clock ticking in the hallway. Richard, my father, slammed his heavy hand down on the solid oak table, making the crystal glasses rattle. "You are delusional," he barked, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "You walk into my house, eat my food, and spout this absolute garbage. You have always been a bitter, jealous woman, Chloe." Harper let out a high-pitched, nervous laugh. She sat across from me, draped in designer clothes funded by my father's ruthless real estate and hedge fund empire. She looked at me with pure disgust. "You are pathetic, Chloe," she sneered. "You run some tiny little app for old people. Do not ever speak to me about my salary." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I reached down into my leather briefcase resting by my feet. The air in the room was suffocating thick with the scent of roasted meat, expensive perfume, and decades of unpunished arrogance. I pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound in heavy black covers and dropped them right in the center of the table. The heavy thud made Victoria jump in her seat. I pointed a finger directly at Harper. "That Prada dress you are wearing," I said, my voice echoing in the dead quiet room. "You expensed it last Tuesday through the corporate account of Apex Medical. You categorized it as a client entertainment cost. It is a federal offense to misuse corporate funds, but we will get to that later. What matters right now is that Apex Medical, the company Daddy gave you to play with, no longer belongs to him." Richard stood up his chair, scraping violently against the hardwood floor. "Shut your mouth and get out of my house," he commanded, pointing toward the door. I ignored him, keeping my eyes locked on Harper. My company Lumina acquired 51% of Apex Medical at 9 o'clock this morning. I bought out 3 of your largest silent partners who were tired of watching you run their investments into the ground. The ink is dry. The wire transfers have cleared. I am the majority shareholder. I am your new boss." Harper looked like she had been slapped. She turned frantically to her husband sitting beside her. Marcus was a highly successful corporate lawyer, a brilliant, sharp African-American man who had made millions cleaning up my father's legal messes. Out of everyone in that room, Marcus was the only one who truly understood the lethal nature of corporate acquisitions. He knew I was not crazy. He knew I would never throw documents on a table unless they were ironclad. Marcus stopped chewing. He did not panic emotionally. He panicked legally. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumbs flying rapidly across the screen as he logged directly into the Securities and Exchange Commission portal. Richard was still yelling. He was pacing behind his chair, calling me a liar, a failure, a woman making up stories to ruin their perfect holiday. Victoria was clutching her pearl necklace, whispering to the guests that I was unwell, that I had always been mentally unstable. But I just watched Marcus. The silence that fell over him was louder than my father's screaming. "Marcus," Richard demanded, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling, "tell this lunatic to get out of my house before I call security." Marcus slowly looked up from his glowing screen. The color had drained from his face. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting from the phone to my father and then finally to me. "Richard," Marcus said, his voice completely hollow, "she is telling the truth. The filings are live on the Federal Registry. The transaction cleared the holding accounts this morning. She owns it. She owns majority control of Apex." Victoria gasped, dropping her wine glass. It shattered against the table, spilling red liquid across the pristine white linen tablecloth. Harper grabbed Marcus by the arm, her fingernails digging into his expensive suit jacket. "What do you mean she owns it?" Harper shrieked, her perfectly curated CEO persona completely evaporating. "Do something, Marcus. You are a lawyer, fix it." "There is nothing to fix," I said calmly, leaning back in my chair. It is a hostile takeover, Harper. It is what happens in the real business world outside of this little bubble where Daddy hands you everything. I have already drafted the restructuring plan. Your executive team is being dissolved on Monday. You can either take the massive pay cut and report directly to my operations manager, or you can pack your desk. Richard grabbed a heavy crystal water pitcher from the table and hurled it directly at the stone fireplace. It exploded into 100 glittering pieces. Several guests screamed and pushed their chairs back, terrified of his sudden physical violence. My father had always been a master of psychological warfare, but losing control, losing his assets to the daughter he discarded, broke his mask completely. He did not care that he was bleeding from a small cut on his hand. He marched around the table and stopped inches from my face. I did not flinch. I looked up at him, smelling the alcohol on his breath, feeling the heat of his rage. "You think you won, Chloe," he whispered. His voice was no longer a yell. It was a venomous, terrifying hiss. "You think buying a single medical supply subsidiary makes you a player in my world. You think you can walk in here and humiliate me in front of my family." "I did not humiliate you," I replied, my voice steady. "I simply beat you at your own game. You told me I would never amount to anything when you froze my bank accounts and changed the locks on the house when I was 20. You told me I was dead to you. Well, the dead came back, Richard, and I brought a checkbook." A dark, twisted smile crept across my father's face. It was the smile of a predator who realized the prey had walked right into a trap. He leaned down, placing both his heavy hands on the arms of my chair, trapping me in place. "Al built a nice little health tech platform, Chloe," he said softly, making sure only I could hear the exact words. "Lumina, connecting elderly patients with home care. Very noble, very lucrative. You think you are so smart using your platform's revenue to buy my subsidiary, but you have no idea what you are actually standing on." My heart gave a slight involuntary beat, but I kept my face entirely blank. "You do not know who actually owns the core technology running that little platform of yours." Richard continued, his eyes gleaming with malicious joy. "You think your code is yours. You think Lumina is safe. You just spent $50 million of your cash reserves to buy Apex, leaving your own company completely exposed. Enjoy this little victory tonight, Chloe, because by next week you will not even own your own name." He stood up straight, adjusted his suit jacket, and looked at Marcus. "Call the security team," Richard ordered. "Have this woman escorted off my property. If she resists, have her arrested for trespassing." I stood up before Marcus could even move. I smoothed down my skirt, picked up my briefcase, and looked around the room. The guests were staring at me in stunned silence. Harper was crying silent tears of rage and humiliation. Victoria could not even look in my direction. "I will show myself out," I said to the room. "Merry Christmas, Harper. Be at the Lumina downtown office at 8 in the morning on Monday. If you are 1 minute late, I will terminate your contract with cause, and you will not get a single cent of severance." I turned and walked out of the dining room, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floors of the grand foyer. I walked out the heavy front doors and into the freezing December night. The cold air hit my face, shocking my system, but I did not stop walking until I reached my car parked at the end of the long, winding driveway. I got into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and gripped the steering wheel. My hands were finally shaking, not from fear of my family, but from the adrenaline of the strike and the chilling weight of my father's final threat. "You do not know who actually owns the core technology running that little platform of yours." His words echoed in my mind over and over again. Lumina was my life's work. I built that health tech platform from absolute nothing. I wrote the original algorithms in a tiny, unheated apartment while working 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. I secured the early-stage funding. I hired every engineer. Every line of code belonged to me. It was legally protected, trademarked, and secured, or so I thought. Richard Hastings did not make empty threats. He was a monster, a manipulator, a man who destroyed lives for sport, but he was not a liar when it came to business. If he said he had a weapon aimed at the core of my company, he had one, and I had just spent a massive portion of my liquid capital executing the hostile takeover of his subsidiary. I had wanted to hit him where it hurt to take away the golden child's prized possession, but in doing so, I had drained my own war chest. I pulled my phone out and immediately dialed Julian. Julian was my chief financial officer, my most trusted advisor, and the man who helped me structure the Apex medical acquisition. He had been with me since the early days, navigating every financial landmine we ever faced. The phone rang 3 times before he answered. "Julian, I need you to run a full audit on our intellectual property holding structures right now," I said, not bothering to say hello. "Chloe, it is Christmas Eve. Julian's tired voice came through the speaker. "I am at my in-laws' house. Did the dinner go badly?" "The dinner went exactly as planned," I replied, staring out the windshield at the imposing gates of my father's estate. I own Apex. But Richard said something right before I left. He threatened Lumina's core technology. He implied I do not actually own it. "I need you to pull the founding documents, the patent filings, the employee non-disclosure agreements, everything. Look for loopholes. Look for anything a ruthless hedge fund manager could exploit." "There is nothing to exploit, Chloe," Julian said reassuringly. "We locked down the IP 3 years ago when we prepped for the Series B funding. Every engineer signed away their rights. The platform is airtight. You are just letting him get in your head. He is trying to rattle you because you just took his daughter's company." Maybe I said shifting the car into drive, but Richard Hastings does not bluff. "Just run the trace, Julian. Start with the original code base. Call me the second you find anything, even if it is 3 in the morning. I hung up the phone and drove away from the estate, the darkness of the winter night swallowing the rearview mirror. I had waited a decade to look my family in the eye and take something from them just like they took everything from me. I had won the battle at the dinner table, but as I sped down the highway toward the city, a cold, sinking feeling settled deep in my stomach. The war had not even started yet. The next 48 hours were going to tear my entire reality apart. I did not know it as I drove home, but the threat my father made was not just about patents or legal loopholes. It was about a betrayal so deep, so close to home, that it would force me to question every single person I had ever trusted. My father was a predator, yes, but he rarely hunted alone. He always had someone on the inside, and I was about to find out exactly who it was. Marcus did not yell. He did not throw a tantrum like my father or hurl insults like my sister. That is because Marcus is a corporate lawyer, a highly successful, razor-sharp African-American man who built his entire career cleaning up the legal disasters Richard Hastings left in his wake. Out of everyone sitting at that massive oak table, Marcus was the only person who truly understood the lethal nature of a hostile corporate acquisition. He knew I was not bluffing. He knew I would never walk into this fortress and throw a stack of documents on the table unless they were absolutely ironclad. I watched him carefully. The panicked energy in the room seemed to bounce right off him as his professional instincts took over. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his phone. His thumbs moved with frantic precision. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was logging directly into the Securities and Exchange Commission federal database. He was checking the live public filings. The dining room was a chaotic symphony of shouting. Richard was pacing behind his chair, his face a deep shade of crimson, barking threats about calling security and having me thrown out into the snow. Harper was clinging to Marcus, her manicured nails digging into his sleeve, shrieking at him to do something to fix it, to use his legal magic to make me disappear. Victoria was clutching her chest loudly, whispering to the guests that I was experiencing a psychotic break. But I ignored all of them. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Marcus. The silence that eventually fell over him was louder than my father screaming. Marcus stopped typing. His eyes remained glued to the glowing screen of his phone. I watched the realization hit him like a physical blow. The absolute certainty he usually carried evaporated in a single second. He swallowed hard. The muscles in his jaw tightened. When he finally looked up, he did not look at Harper. He bypassed his wife entirely and looked straight at the head of the table. "Richard," Marcus said. His voice was completely hollow, stripped of all its usual polished confidence. The room suddenly went dead quiet. Every guest held their breath, waiting for the brilliant lawyer to tear my claims apart. "She is telling the truth," Marcus stated. His voice wavered slightly, but the words cut through the room with devastating clarity. "The federal filings are live on the registry. The transaction cleared the holding accounts this morning. She owns it, Richard. She owns majority control of Apex." Harper let out a sound that was half gasp and half sob. She shook her husband by the arm frantically. "What do you mean she owns it?" she demanded, her perfectly curated executive persona completely shattering. "You are a lawyer, Marcus. Fix this right now." But Marcus just slowly shook his head, staring at the phone in his hand as if it were a live grenade. "There is nothing to fix, Harper," he replied, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "The ink is dry. She is the majority shareholder." The reality of the situation finally penetrated my father's massive ego. The pristine image of his perfect holiday dinner was completely dead. Richard grabbed his crystal wine glass and hurled it violently against the stone fireplace. The glass shattered instantly with a deafening crash. Dark red wine splattered across the white marble hearth like a crime scene. Several guests gasped in terror, pushing their heavy wooden chairs back and physically recoiling from the table. Victoria let out a high-pitched shriek, pressing her hands over her mouth. Richard did not care about his wealthy audience anymore. He marched toward my end of the table, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The veins in his neck were bulging against his tailored silk collar. "You think you have won!" he roared. His voice was so loud it seemed to shake the crystal chandelier hanging above us. "You think you can walk into my house, disrespect me in front of my colleagues, and take what belongs to my family?" I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my hands folded calmly in my lap. I just looked at the man who had spent my entire life making me feel completely worthless. "I already did," I replied evenly. But the absolute fury in his eyes suddenly vanished. It was replaced by a twisted, malicious smile that made my stomach drop. Richard leaned forward, placing both his heavy hands on the edge of the table. He leaned in so close I could smell the sharp tang of expensive scotch on his breath. The blind anger was gone. Now he was looking at me like a predator who had just watched his prey walk directly into a steel trap. "You are a complete fool, Chloe," he spat, dropping his voice to a chilling low register. "You think you are a business genius for building that cheap little health platform of yours. You just spent your entire cash reserve trying to hurt me. You think you own Lumina, but you have absolutely no idea who actually holds the core technology of your precious company." My heart stopped. The air in the formal dining room suddenly felt incredibly thin, making it hard to breathe. Lumina was my entire life. I had written the original code. I had hired every single engineer. I had secured the patents with my own legal team, or at least I thought I had. Richard was a ruthless monster, but he was not a man who made empty threats when it came to business. He never bluffed about assets. If he said he had his hands on my core technology, it meant he had already planted a bomb inside my empire. And I had just handed him the perfect detonator by draining all my liquid funds to execute the hostile takeover of Harper's company. I stared back into his cold, triumphant eyes. I refused to let him see the sudden spike of absolute terror running through my veins. I kept my expression entirely blank, but my mind was spinning out of control. I had walked into this house thinking I was the one delivering the final blow. I did not realize I was standing on top of a ticking time bomb, and the timer had just hit 0. I did not wait for the sun to rise. I left that toxic house and drove straight to the airport. I caught the first flight back to New York and walked into Lumina headquarters just as the city was waking up. But my office was already in a state of total panic. The glass-walled engineering floor was swarming with my technical team. Nobody was sitting down. Red warning banners were flashing across the main monitoring screens, illuminating the room in a harsh artificial light. My lead security architect intercepted me before I could even take off my winter coat. His face was pale and his hands were physically shaking as he handed me a tablet. "We have a massive security breach, Chloe," he said. "The firewall was bypassed from the inside." I looked at the data logs and felt the floor drop out from under me. It was not a random cyber attack, it was a surgical strike. The intruder had bypassed the general user data and went straight for the vault. The VIP client registry was completely gone. Highly sensitive medical requests, residential addresses of elderly patients, and the personal financial profiles of the families who paid top dollar for our premium home care services. All of it had been extracted in the middle of the night. The timing was absolutely lethal. This was not just about losing data. This was about losing the entire future of my company. Lumina was exactly 5 days away from closing our Series C funding round. We had $150 million in capital commitments sitting on the table waiting for final signatures. I desperately needed that cash injection. I had just drained our internal liquid reserves to execute the hostile takeover of my sister company. If this funding round collapsed, Lumina would not have enough runway to survive the next quarter. I realized with a sickening clarity that the minor server glitches we experienced 48 hours ago were not routine maintenance issues. I had been too distracted planning my revenge at the Christmas dinner to notice the warning signs. My father knew exactly what he was doing. He had let me drain my own accounts to buy his subsidiary while simultaneously triggering a bomb in my own basement. My cell phone began to vibrate violently in my coat pocket. A second later, the desk phones across the executive suite started ringing in a chaotic chorus. The news of a potential data vulnerability had already leaked. Wall Street investors have an uncanny ability to smell blood in the water. I pulled my phone out and answered. It was the managing partner of the Silicon Valley venture capital firm leading our Series C round. He did not bother exchanging pleasantries. He did not ask how my holiday was. "Chloe, we are seeing market rumors about a critical data breach at Lumina," he said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "We are freezing the term sheet immediately. We cannot expose our limited partners to this kind of liability." I tried to speak to assure him we were containing the issue, but he hung up before I could finish my sentence. 10 minutes later, a second major investor called to officially back out. Then a third. My inbox was flooding with cancellation notices. The empire I had spent 10 years building was actively burning to the ground right in front of my eyes. And the worst part was the absolute certainty that the arsonist had a key to the front door. The security logs confirmed the breach did not come from an external hacker. The firewall was bypassed using elite administrative credentials. Someone standing inside my own company had handed my father the match. The lead security architect walked back into my office 10 minutes later. He did not have a tablet this time. He just handed me a single piece of printed paper. "We traced the origin IP of the administrative bypass," he said, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. I looked at the string of numbers, and the internal network location mapped right beside it. Executive Suite, Office 4. Office 4 belonged to Julian, my chief financial officer, the man who had stood by my side for 5 years, the man who had helped me structure the hostile takeover of my sister's company, the man I had called from the freezing driveway of my father's estate just hours ago. The betrayal did not hit me like a wave of sadness. It hit me like a shot of pure ice water straight to the heart. I did not scream. I did not throw anything. I did not break down in tears. Crying was for the weak girl my father threw out into the snow 20 years ago. I was a CEO under attack, and panic was a luxury I could not afford. I turned back to my computer screen. My hands did not shake at all. With 4 precise clicks, I completely revoked Julian's administrative privileges. I locked his corporate email. I severed his access to every single financial dashboard, banking portal, and internal server. I digitally erased his entire existence inside Lumina in less than 10 seconds. Then I reached for the intercom button on my desk. "Julian, I need you in my office right now," I said, keeping my tone perfectly casual and professional. He walked in exactly 30 seconds later. He was holding a fresh cup of coffee, wearing his usual perfectly tailored navy suit. He looked exhausted, playing the role of the dedicated executive perfectly. He even offered me a sympathetic smile as he closed the door behind him. "Chloe, I am so incredibly sorry about the venture capital firms pulling out," he started saying, taking a step toward my desk. "We will figure out a way to stabilize the cash flow." I did not let him finish his performance. I picked up the printed network log and slammed it flat onto the center of my glass desk. The loud smack echoed in the room, making him flinch. "Look at it," I ordered. Julian stepped forward and looked down at the paper. I watched the blood drain entirely from his face. The color vanished from his cheeks, and his confident posture completely collapsed in a fraction of a second. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. I picked up my cell phone and dialed the digits for the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office in New York. I left my thumb hovering directly over the green call button. "I am setting a timer for exactly 60 seconds, Julian." I said, my voice completely hollow and devoid of any human warmth. "You have 1 minute to tell me exactly how my father compromised you. If you lie to me, if you hesitate for even a second, or if you insult my intelligence by trying to deny what is on that paper, I will press this button. You will be walking out of this lobby in federal handcuffs before that cup of coffee in your hand gets cold. Your 60 seconds starts right now. Start talking." Julian stared at my thumb hovering over the green call button. He did not even make it to the 15-second mark. He broke completely. His knees buckled and he dropped heavily into the leather chair across from my desk. The coffee spilled over the rim of his cup, burning his hand, but he did not even seem to notice. "Please, Chloe." Julian begged, his voice cracking as genuine tears welled up in his eyes. "Do not call the federal agents. If you call them, my life is completely over." "Keep talking." I ordered, my thumb still resting on the phone. "I owe $2 million, he confessed, the words spilling out of his mouth in a frantic rush. "Offshore sports betting. It got completely out of control. The people I owed money to were not the kind of people who send collection letters. They showed up at my house. They threatened my wife. I was desperate. I was trying to find a way to quietly borrow against my equity in Lumina, but your father found out. I narrowed my eyes. Richard Hastings had an entire network of private investigators who did nothing but look for leverage over useful people. He bought my debt. Julian continued wiping his face with a trembling hand. Richard paid off the bookies. He told me I owed him now, but he did not want money. He wanted access. What exactly did you give him, Julian? I demanded, my voice dangerously low. I did not just want the client lists, Julian said, looking down at his shoes. He forced me to pull the raw source code for your matching algorithms. Every single line of proprietary code you wrote to build this platform. He had me download it to a physical drive and hand it over to his legal team. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with terrifying clarity. The threat at the Christmas dinner finally made perfect sense. What did he do with the code, Julian? I asked, though I already knew the answer. I took your algorithms and rushed them to the Federal Patent Office, Julian whispered. He filed the intellectual property claims last month under a newly formed shell company registered in Delaware. He backdated the development logs using forged documents. Chloe, legally on paper, his shell company owns the core technology of Lumina. If you proceed with the Series C funding, or if you launch your new update, he is going to file a massive intellectual property lawsuit and shut down your entire platform with a federal injunction. I sat back in my chair. The sheer scale of my father's malice was breathtaking. He had not just planned to ruin my funding round, he had systematically stolen the very foundation of my life's work. He weaponized the legal system to trap me using my own trusted executive as the inside man. That was exactly why he sat at the head of his dining table last night with such absolute arrogance. He thought he had me completely cornered. He thought I was holding a dead company. I looked at Julian. He was shivering in his expensive suit, waiting for me to press the button and end his life. In the corporate world, betrayal usually demands immediate execution. You fire the traitor you call the authorities, and you try to salvage what is left of your reputation. But I did not spend 10 years building an empire just to play by the standard rulebook. My father had taught me that leverage is the most powerful weapon in the world, and right now I held all the leverage over the man sitting across from me. I slowly lifted my thumb off the green call button and placed my phone face down on the glass desk. I am not calling the federal agents, Julian, I said, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. And I am not firing you either. Julian looked up, his eyes wide with absolute shock and desperate confusion. You are not, he stammered. No, I replied, standing up and walking around to the front of my desk. You are going to go back to your office. You are going to sit at your desk, and you are going to continue playing the role of the loyal spy. But you do not work for Richard Hastings anymore. You work for me. You are going to be my double agent. Julian swallowed hard, nodding vigorously. Yes, anything, Chloe. Whatever you need me to do, I will do it. I leaned against the edge of my desk, looking down at him. You are going to send my father a highly confidential financial report by the end of the day. But it will not be the real one. It will be a completely fabricated document I am going to draft for you right now. I walked back to my computer and began typing. I did not need to invent a complex scenario. I just needed to show my father exactly what he wanted to see. I altered our internal balance sheets, drastically inflated our operational burn rate, and projected a complete cash exhaustion within exactly 14 days. I made it look like the collapse of the Series C funding round had fatally wounded us. I painted a picture of a desperate, bleeding company that was mere days away from filing for absolute bankruptcy. I printed the fake report and handed it to Julian. You are going to tell Richard that the data breach caused total panic, I instructed, staring directly into his terrified eyes. You will tell him that the venture capital firms pulled out, that we have zero liquid cash left after the Apex Medical acquisition, and that I am completely out of options. You will convince him that Lumina is taking its final breaths. Julian took the paper with trembling hands. But why, he asked, his voice shaking. If he thinks you are bankrupt, he will move in for the kill. He will try to crush you completely. That is exactly what I'm counting on, Julian, I said, a cold smile forming on my lips. My father is a vulture. He cannot resist a dying animal. If he thinks I am weak and out of cash, he will overextend himself to deliver the final lethal blow. He will borrow money he does not have. He will leverage assets he cannot afford to lose just to ensure I am completely destroyed. I walked back to my chair and sat down, dismissing him with a sharp wave of my hand. Send the report, Julian. Throw the bait into the water. Let us see how much debt my father is willing to drown in just to watch me fail. Julian called me at 6 in the morning, his voice trembling so hard I could hear his coffee cup rattling against his phone. The fake financial report had worked better than we could have ever imagined. My father had swallowed the bait whole. When a predator believes his prey is mortally wounded, he stops being cautious. He becomes blinded by his own greed. Richard genuinely believed Lumina had less than 2 weeks of cash left before total insolvency. But he did not just want to watch my company slide into a standard bankruptcy. He wanted to make sure there was no possibility of a miracle recovery. He wanted to suffocate us operationally before we could even reach a courtroom. To pull off a trap of this magnitude, Richard needed massive amounts of cash instantly. He mobilized every single dollar he could touch. He pulled credit lines from his private equity firm. He liquidated short-term corporate bond portfolios at a massive loss. And then he did something so wildly arrogant, it made my blood run cold when Julian read the property filings to me. He placed a secondary mortgage on the ancestral Hastings family estate in Connecticut. The sprawling colonial mansion where I was raised, the ultimate symbol of his social status and family pride, was now pledged as collateral to a commercial bank. I took those tens of millions in fresh cash and went on a targeted buying spree across the health tech sector. He targeted Lumina's primary supply chain. My platform relied on 3 exclusive hardware manufacturers for our elderly monitoring devices, specialized server infrastructure, and secure patient logistics networks. Within 24 hours, Richard acquired controlling equity stakes in 2 of those suppliers and signed exclusive distribution agreements with the third. By noon, my operations floor was in absolute chaos. Official termination notices were flooding into our corporate system. Our hardware supplier ended our contract citing artificial inventory shortages. Our primary server provider demanded an immediate 300% fee increase or threatened a total system blackout by Friday. Richard was using his new acquisitions like a heavy iron boot, pressing it directly onto Lumina's neck to choke us out before our artificial 2-week clock ran out. But in his blind rage to destroy me, Richard made the exact fatal mistake I had been praying for. He had overextended himself completely. He had tied up all his liquid capital into illiquid, highly leveraged supply companies. He had backed his massive bank loans with his own family estate and fragile holding assets. Hastings Capital Holdings, the parent company at the very center of his entire financial empire, was sitting wide open, dangerously vulnerable, and completely drained of cash reserves. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my executive office, looking down at the rainy streets of Manhattan. The chessboard had completely flipped. Richard thought he was executing a lethal siege against a dying company. He did not realize he had just stepped out from behind his fortress walls, leaving his own heart completely exposed. I did not need to defend Lumina against his supply chain blockade. I did not need to waste time begging his puppet suppliers for mercy. I just needed to strike directly at his mothership. If I could execute a swift, aggressive, hostile takeover of Hastings Capital Holdings, I would automatically own his parent company. I would own his debt. I would own his private equity firm. I would own the suppliers he had just purchased, and I would own the mortgage on his precious estate. But a move of that magnitude required brute, unyielding force. It required cold, hard cash. I calculated the exact numbers with my legal team. I needed $50 million in cash immediately. Not assets, not promises, not credit lines. I needed $50 million sitting in a liquid escrow account before the financial markets opened on Friday. The timing was brutal. The Apex Medical acquisition had drained our internal cash reserves. Our Series C venture capital partners had walked away after the staged data breach. I was holding the blueprint for the ultimate corporate checkmate, but I was standing in the dark with an empty bank account. I had less than 48 hours to find $50 million, or Richard's artificial blockade would turn into a very real death sentence for Lumina. I needed a shark. I needed someone on Wall Street who ate men like my father for breakfast. I did not waste time calling commercial banks. Traditional lenders take weeks to approve $50 million. I had less than 48 hours. I needed a shark. I needed someone who operated outside the sluggish bureaucracy of standard finance. I went straight to Wall Street to meet Veronica. Veronica was a living legend in the private equity sector. She was a ruthless, calculating billionaire who had made her fortune by stepping over the corporate corpses of failing executives. Her office on the 60th floor overlooking the financial district was exactly like her. It was cold, imposing, and stripped of any human warmth. There were no family photos. There were no soft colors. There was just glass steel and a massive black marble desk. I sat across from her and laid out the entire hostile takeover blueprint. I showed her the exact vulnerabilities in Hastings Capital Holdings. I showed her my father's over-leveraged positions. I gave her the clear, undeniable math. I needed $50 million in liquid cash by Friday morning. In return, I offered her a heavily discounted premium on the return, backed by the massive assets of the parent company once the takeover was complete. Veronica listened in complete silence. She did not take notes. She just stared at me with eyes as sharp and unforgiving as broken glass. When I finished my pitch, she slowly closed the leather folder containing my financial projections. She pushed it back across the cold marble desk. "The answer is no, Chloe." Her voice was calm, almost entirely bored. I leaned forward, fighting to keep the rising desperation out of my tone. "The math is flawless, Veronica. The return on investment is guaranteed within 90 days. Richard has left his entire financial flank completely exposed." "I do not care about the math," Veronica replied, lacing her fingers together. "The math is fine. The risk is the person sitting in front of me. I do not finance family vendettas. I finance businesses. And right now I am looking at a desperate woman trying to settle a childhood score." I kept my face perfectly still, but my heart began to hammer violently against my ribs. "It is a strategic corporate acquisition," I countered, keeping my voice steady. "It is a temper tantrum," Veronica interrupted her words, snapping like a whip in the quiet room. "Do you think I do not know exactly who you are? Do you think I do not run a comprehensive background check on anyone asking me for $50 million? You are Richard Hastings' discarded daughter. You are the girl he threw out into the freezing cold 20 years ago in favor of his shiny new family. You are currently bleeding out. Your Series C funding just evaporated. Your supply chain is actively collapsing. You are not trying to execute a smart business move. You are trying to punch the father who never loved you." I gripped the arms of my leather chair. My fingernails dug deep into the upholstery. I wanted to stand up and scream, but I forced my breathing to remain absolutely controlled. "You do not know anything about my family," I said softly. Veronica leaned forward, her dark eyes locking onto mine with lethal precision. "I know enough," she said, twisting the psychological knife. "I know that blood dictates behavior. I know that when the pressure gets high enough, people revert to their true genetic nature. Your father is a snake. But your biological mother was even worse. She was a runaway debtor. She vanished into the wind the second the financial heat got too high, leaving a massive trail of unpaid loans and shattered contracts. She was a coward who ran from her obligations. So tell me, Chloe, when my $50 million is on the line and your hostile takeover hits a legal brick wall, what guarantees you will not panic and disappear exactly like she did?" The vast corner office went completely silent. The air felt incredibly heavy and suffocating. Veronica had not just rejected my business proposal. She had bypassed all my carefully constructed corporate armor and struck directly at the deepest, most agonizing wound of my entire life. She was aggressively testing me. She was pushing me to the absolute edge to see if I would break, to see if I would cry, to see if I was truly the weak, unstable girl my father always claimed I was. I did not cry. I did not shrink back into my chair. The mention of my mother was supposed to be the kill shot to my confidence. Instead, it unlocked a rage so pure and so cold that it completely steadied my shaking hands. I stood up. I slammed both of my palms flat against the surface of Veronica's black marble desk. The loud crack of my hands hitting the stone echoed sharply across the massive office. Veronica did not flinch, but her eyes narrowed. She was finally paying real attention. "My mother did not run from her debts," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "She did not vanish into the wind. My father forged those financial documents. When my mother found out he was embezzling from her family's trust fund, she threatened to go to the authorities. So Richard did what Richard does best. He paid off a team of private psychiatrists. He had my mother forcibly committed to a psychiatric ward, declared legally incompetent, and he swallowed her entire estate while she was locked in a padded room heavily sedated against her will. That is the man I am going up against, and that is exactly why I know how to destroy him." I did not break eye contact with Veronica. The silence in the room stretched heavy and electric. I am not a frightened little girl trying to settle a childhood score. I continued standing perfectly straight. I am an apex predator who just found the exact vulnerability in the biggest target on Wall Street. I do not want your pity, Veronica. I want your capital, and I am willing to bet my entire existence on this execution. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. I had asked my legal team to draft it in the car ride over, just in case the financial projections were not enough to convince the devil. I pushed the document across the cold desk right until it touched Veronica's perfectly manicured hands. "Read it," I commanded. Veronica looked down at the paper. For the first time since I walked into her office, a flicker of genuine surprise crossed her face. "That is a total forfeiture agreement," I explained, keeping my voice absolutely flat. "Give me the $50 million in liquid cash today. Give me exactly 7 days to execute the hostile takeover of Hastings Capital Holdings. If I fail, if my father blocks me, if I miss the deadline by a single minute, that contract automatically triggers. I will sign over 100% of Lumina's equity directly to your holding firm. The transfer price is exactly $1. You will own my patents, my technology, and my entire user base for the price of a cup of coffee." Veronica slowly looked up from the contract. The boredom was entirely gone from her expression. She was looking at me the way a shark looks at another shark. "You are betting your entire life's work on a 7-day window," Veronica said, her tone laced with a newfound dark respect. "If Richard maneuvers out of this, you lose absolutely everything. You walk away with nothing." "Richard is not maneuvering out of anything," I replied smoothly. "His neck is already in the noose. I just need you to hand me the lever to drop the floor." Veronica stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. The tension in the room was suffocating. Then a slow, razor-thin smile crept across her face. She reached into her top drawer, pulled out a heavy gold pen, and signed her name at the bottom of the forfeiture agreement. "You will have the $50 million in your escrow account by 4 o'clock this afternoon," Veronica said, sliding the paper back across the desk. "Do not disappoint me, Chloe. I have always wanted to own a health tech platform." I took the signed contract, folded it neatly, and placed it back in my briefcase. "I will send you the takeover confirmation next Thursday," I replied. I turned and walked out of the glass office. I had the money. The trap was fully armed. But as I stepped into the elevator to leave the building, my phone vibrated in my pocket. The war was not waiting for Thursday. I stepped out of the heavy brass doors of the Wall Street high-rise and into the freezing New York wind. My phone vibrated intensely in the palm of my hand. It was a secure encrypted notification from my corporate banking portal. The escrow account had just received a massive incoming wire transfer, exactly $50 million. The funds were cleared, locked, and ready to deploy. For exactly 3 seconds, I stood on the crowded sidewalk and allowed myself to breathe. I finally had the ultimate weapon to crush my father. The hostile takeover was fully funded, but on the 4th second, my phone vibrated again. It was not a banking notification. It was a plain text message from an unregistered burner number. I opened it, shielding the screen from the glaring afternoon sun. The message was short, brutal, and completely terrifying. "I know exactly what you are about to do. Meet me in the underground parking garage of your office building in 20 minutes. If you do not show up or if you bring security, I am calling Richard right now and telling him to check his financial blind spots." My blood ran entirely cold. The bustling noise of the city traffic faded away. There was only one person in my father's inner circle smart enough to look past the fake bankruptcy report and see the massive hostile takeover forming in the shadows. Marcus, my sister's husband, the brilliant razor-sharp corporate fixer. While Richard was blinded by his own greed, Marcus had been quietly watching the board. He had recognized the exact same vulnerability I had found. Marcus knew how the high-stakes game was played, and he knew that his father-in-law had just left the entire castle gate completely wide open. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. The stakes had just multiplied by 1,000. If Marcus made that phone call to Richard, my element of surprise was instantly dead. Richard would immediately pull back his over-leveraged assets, restructure his debt, and close the fatal loophole. My 7-day window would slam shut forever. I would fail to execute the takeover. The forfeiture contract with Veronica would automatically trigger, and she would seize 100% of Lumina for a single dollar. Marcus was holding a match directly over the gasoline. I did not type a reply. Replying would show panic, and I refused to give him that satisfaction. I stepped to the edge of the curb, flagged down a passing taxi, and gave the driver the address to my headquarters. I leaned my head against the cold window as the car sped uptown. I was not going to run. I was going to go straight down into the concrete basement of my building and face the man who was threatening to burn my entire life to the ground. The underground parking garage beneath my office building was damp and completely deserted. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the concrete pillars. I stepped out of the private elevator and the cold air immediately hit my face. I did not have to wait long. A sleek black Mercedes sedan was idling in the darkest corner of the third sublevel. The driver's side door opened. Marcus stepped out into the dim light. I was wearing a bespoke charcoal suit and a camel hair overcoat that probably cost more than my first car. His shoes were polished to a perfect mirror shine. From a distance, he looked like the absolute picture of Wall Street power. But as I walked closer, the illusion completely fractured. Marcus was sweating in the freezing garage. His usually confident posture was rigid and his eyes darted nervously toward the elevator banks as if he expected federal agents to burst through the doors at any second. The brilliant, untouchable corporate lawyer was in full-blown panic mode. "You are playing a very dangerous game," Chloe Marcus said, as I stopped a few feet away from him. His voice echoed off the concrete walls. "I am not playing any games, Marcus," I replied, keeping my hands inside my coat pockets so he could not see my fists clenching. "You are the one hiding in a basement sending anonymous threats. Why did you not just call Richard? If you know about my takeover strategy, why are you standing here instead of warning him?" Marcus let out a harsh, bitter laugh. He leaned against the hood of his Mercedes, running a hand over his face. "Because Richard is a walking corpse," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "He just does not know it yet." I kept my expression entirely neutral, letting him do the talking. "I am his lead counsel." Chloe Marcus continued, taking a step toward me. "I have to review the underwriting for every major loan he takes. When he went on his buying spree yesterday, he leveraged everything. He mortgaged the family estate. He leveraged the holding company. He pulled tens of millions of dollars in commercial bank loans in less than 12 hours. But the banks demanded collateral, heavy collateral." Marcus stopped and looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of disgust and absolute terror. "Richard did not have enough clean collateral," Marcus whispered. "He fabricated the asset valuations. He bundled empty commercial leases and claimed they were fully tenanted. He inflated the equity of his shell companies by 300%. He submitted those documents across state lines to a federally insured bank. It is wire fraud, Chloe. It is textbook, undeniable federal wire fraud." The magnitude of what Marcus was saying hung in the cold, damp air. Wire fraud carried a 20-year prison sentence per count. Richard had not just overextended his finances to destroy me. He had committed a massive federal crime to get the cash. Marcus took another step closer, his polished facade entirely stripped away. "When the bank realizes the collateral is fake, they are going to call in the loans," Marcus said, his breathing shallow. "The entire empire is going to collapse. Richard is going to federal prison. And as his lawyer, if I do not distance myself right now, the Department of Justice is going to pull me down right alongside him. I am not going to let that old man drag me into a jail cell. His ship is sinking fast, and I am jumping off right now." I looked at the terrified man standing in front of me. He was not here to protect my father. He was here to save himself. But a corporate shark like Marcus never abandons a ship without grabbing a life raft first. "So you want to jump ship," I said calmly. "What does that have to do with me, Marcus?" Marcus straightened his overcoat. The panic in his eyes was suddenly replaced by cold, hard calculation. He was about to play his hand. Marcus reached into the open door of his sedan and leaned into the back seat. When he turned back around, he was holding a thick, faded brown leather portfolio. It looked incredibly old, its edges worn and cracked from decades of sitting in some hidden corporate vault. He held it up, clutching it tightly against his chest as if it were a shield. "You want to execute a hostile takeover," Marcus said, his voice regaining a fraction of its familiar courtroom arrogance. "You want to take his companies. That is brilliant, Chloe. It really is. But taking his companies will only make him bankrupt. If you just take his money, he will declare, Chapter 11, hire a fleet of defense attorneys, and spend the next 10 years fighting you in civil court. He will drag you through the mud. He will never actually suffer." I kept my eyes locked on the leather portfolio. "What is in the folder, Marcus?" I asked, my voice dangerously still. "This is the smoking gun," Marcus replied, stepping closer. This is the kill shot. I spent the last 3 years auditing Richard's oldest private holding companies to clean up his legal messes. I found a hidden safety deposit box. He kept the hard copies because he is an arrogant old man who likes to keep trophies of the people he completely destroys. Marcus slowly opened the flap of the portfolio and pulled out a heavy stack of yellowing legal documents. 25 years ago, your biological mother did not go crazy, Marcus said, looking right into my eyes. And she did not go broke. She had a massive trust fund. It was generational wealth that was legally supposed to transfer directly to you on your 18th birthday. My breath caught in my throat. The freezing air of the parking garage suddenly felt like shattered glass in my lungs. Richard wanted that money. Marcus continued his words, hitting me like physical blows. But he could not access it as long as your mother was sane and you were the primary beneficiary. So he forged her signature. He fabricated extensive power of attorney documents. He paid off 2 private medical examiners to declare her mentally unfit. He locked her in a psychiatric facility, and he drained every single cent of your inheritance to build his first real estate firm. Hastings Capital Holdings was built on stolen money, Chloe. Your stolen money. I stared at the yellowing paper in Marcus's trembling hand. Even in the dim fluorescent light, I could clearly see the faded blue ink signatures. The signatures that had destroyed my mother's life. The signatures that had condemned me to a childhood of emotional abuse and financial starvation, all while my father built an empire on the future he stole from me. If you take these original documents to a federal judge, Richard does not just go bankrupt, Marcus said, a desperate, greedy light shining in his eyes. He goes to federal prison for the rest of his natural life. You get to reclaim your inheritance with decades of compounding interest. You get to utterly annihilate him. You get everything you have ever wanted. I forced my jaw to unclench. My hands were balled into fists so tight my fingernails were cutting into my own palms. How much, Marcus? I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. A lawyer like you does not hand over the murder weapon for free. Marcus straightened his posture, puffing out his chest as he tried to reclaim his leverage. I want 10% of Lumina's total equity, he demanded, post-takeover. When you absorb Hastings Capital, my 10% applies to the new combined corporate entity, and I want a bulletproof indemnity contract signed by your legal team. Full legal immunity. You will guarantee I am completely shielded from any civil or criminal liability regarding Richard's wire fraud and corporate malfeasance. You get the kill shot, and I get a golden parachute and a get-out-of-jail-free card. He held the stack of aged papers out toward me, dangling the ultimate weapon right in front of my face. Do we have a deal? Chloe, Marcus asked, his tone hardening into an absolute ultimatum. Or do I walk over to a shredder right now, burn the evidence, and let you fight your father with both hands tied behind your back? Marcus stood under the flickering fluorescent light, holding my entire past and my entire future in his hands. He was smiling. It was that signature arrogant smirk he wore in the courtroom right before he destroyed a witness on the stand. He thought he had me completely backed into a corner. He thought I was just a desperate daughter who would pay any price to finally watch her father burn. Any other CEO would have taken the deal. 10% of a company is a massive price, but to put a monster like Richard Hastings in a prison cell forever, most people would sign the contract without hesitating. Marcus was counting on my emotional trauma. He was counting on my hatred blinding my business logic. But he forgot one crucial detail. I did not survive Richard Hastings by letting my emotions control my negotiations. I did not reach for the leather portfolio. I did not pull out a pen. Instead, I slowly reached into the deep pocket of my wool overcoat. I pulled out my cell phone, swiped the screen, and tapped a single button. A harsh digital beep echoed in the quiet concrete garage. Then Marcus heard his own voice playing back through the speaker of my phone. The audio was perfectly clear. I want 10% of Lumina total equity, the recorded voice of Marcus echoed off the concrete pillars. And I want a bulletproof indemnity contract. Do we have a deal, Chloe? Or do I walk over to a shredder right now and burn the evidence? I tapped the screen again and the recording stopped. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy. Marcus froze. His arrogant smile vanished so fast, it looked like it had been physically slapped off his face. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking sickly and pale under the harsh garage lights. His eyes locked onto my phone in absolute horror. You are wearing a wire, he whispered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. I am a woman, meeting a desperate corporate lawyer in an underground parking garage. I replied, my voice completely flat and devoid of any mercy. Did you really think I would walk down here without pressing record on my secure cloud server? That audio file was just uploaded in real time to multiple encrypted locations. Marcus took a step back, bumping into the hood of his Mercedes. "You cannot use that," he stammered frantically, trying to find his legal footing. "It is inadmissible. It is a two-party consent state." I took a step forward, completely closing the distance between us. "I do not care about civil court admissibility, Marcus," I said, looking right into his terrified eyes. "I care about the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Let us review the law since you seem to have forgotten it in your panic. You just admitted to discovering massive federal wire fraud committed by your client. Instead of reporting it, you actively concealed a felony. Then you brought stolen financial documents across state lines to extort the CEO of a major tech platform." I paused, letting the reality of his situation crash down on him. "That is not a civil dispute," Marcus Audie continued, my voice sharp and unforgiving. "That is federal extortion. That is blackmail. That is the immediate and permanent loss of your license to practice law in the United States. And when the federal prosecutors hear this tape, they will not offer you a plea deal. They will give you 15 years in a maximum security federal prison." Marcus was physically shaking now. The polished, untouchable attorney was completely gone. He was just a terrified man staring at the total destruction of his entire life. "You would not do that." He breathed desperately, searching my face for any sign of a bluff. "Harper is your sister. I am family. You are a parasite who lived off the money my father stole from my dead mother," I whispered, my voice dripping with absolute venom. "Do not ever use the word family with me." I held out my empty hand, keeping my palm facing up. "Here is my counteroffer, Marcus," I said. "You are going to hand me that leather portfolio right now. You are not getting 10% of Lumina. You are not getting a single share. You are not getting legal indemnity from my corporate team. You are getting absolutely nothing." Marcus stared at my open hand. He was completely trapped, and we both knew it. "If you hand me that folder, I will wait exactly 48 hours before I send this audio file to the authorities," I told him. "That gives you 2 days to pack your expensive suits, get in your car, and run as far away from Richard Hastings as you possibly can. But if you pull your hand back, if you even think about walking toward a shredder, I will press send right now. The FBI will arrest you before you even drive out of this parking garage." Marcus looked at the leather folder in his hands. He looked at my phone. The fight completely drained out of him. He was a man who had spent his life bullying the weak, but the second he faced someone who held a bigger weapon, he immediately collapsed. His shoulders slumped in total defeat. Without saying another word, he slowly reached out and placed the heavy yellowing portfolio directly into my open hand. He did not ask for a contract. He did not ask for equity. He surrendered completely. I gripped the leather folder tightly. The weight of it felt incredible. "Your 48 hours starts right now, Marcus," I said. "I suggest you start driving." I turned my back on him and walked straight toward the elevator. I did not look back as I heard his car door slam and his tires screech against the concrete. I had the money from Veronica. I had the murder weapon from Marcus. But as I stepped into the elevator and opened the old leather flap, I realized the war was about to change from a corporate takeover to something entirely different. The heavy metal doors of the private elevator closed, sealing me inside the quiet steel box. The hum of the machinery pulling me upward was the only sound in the confined space. My hands were finally shaking, but not from fear. I unclasped the brass lock on the aged leather portfolio. The distinct smell of old paper and dust immediately hit the air. I flipped through the first few pages. There they were, the forged trust fund transfer authorizations, the fake power of attorney documents, the falsified signatures that legally stripped my mother of her generational wealth and handed it directly to Richard Hastings. Marcus had been entirely right about the financial crime. The evidence was absolutely undeniable. But as I pulled the heavy stack of banking records aside, another manila envelope caught my eye. It was tucked all the way in the back of the portfolio. It was stamped with the logo of a private intelligence firm. I looked at the date printed in black ink on the top right corner. The report was dated exactly 10 years ago. I stared at the date, my mind completely freezing. That made absolutely no sense. My father had told me my mother died of sudden heart failure in that psychiatric facility 25 years ago. I had stood at a closed casket funeral when I was a teenager. I had spent my entire life believing she was buried in the ground. I ripped the envelope open. A stack of surveillance logs and glossy 8x10 photographs slid out into my hands. My breath caught sharply in my throat. I stared at the topmost photograph. It was a grainy, long-lens shot of a woman sweeping the front porch of a small, rundown bookstore in a quiet, rainy town in Oregon. Her hair was completely silver. Her posture was hunched with years of exhaustion and deep, lingering fear. She looked old and tired, but I knew the shape of her face. I knew the way she held her hands. I would recognize her anywhere. It was my mother. I frantically flipped through the pages of the investigator's report. The typed notes detailed a massive, ongoing surveillance operation. Subject successfully located in Portland. Subject currently operating under the legal alias Evelyn Carter. Subject lives in total isolation. Subject shows zero intention of contacting the primary target, Chloe Hastings. The papers slipped from my hands and scattered across the floor of the elevator. She did not die in that hospital. She did not suffer a heart failure. She had escaped. Or even worse, Richard had orchestrated her release under the brutal condition that she completely vanish and never try to contact me again. He had kept her terrified, constantly running and hiding under a fake identity for 2.5 decades, just so he could maintain control of her stolen fortune without any legal contest. He told me she was dead, so I would never go looking for her. He let me mourn a woman who was still breathing just to protect his balance sheet. The elevator chimed as it reached my executive floor. The steel doors slid open, revealing the bustling, brightly lit lobby of my company. But I did not step out immediately. I dropped to my knees on the elevator floor and picked up the photograph of my mother. For the past 10 years, every single thing I did was fueled by a desperate need for validation. Every late night I spent writing code, every aggressive corporate negotiation, every dollar I made building Lumina. It was all a subconscious crusade to prove to Richard Hastings that I was not a failure. I wanted to show the monster who threw me away that I was brilliant. I wanted to beat him at his own game just to earn a seat at a table I was never allowed to sit at. But looking at the terrified, exhausted face of the woman who gave me life, all of that corporate ambition completely evaporated. I did not care about proving myself to Wall Street anymore. I did not care about earning the respect of my toxic family. The hostile takeover of Hastings Capital Holdings was no longer just a business strategy to save my platform. It was a highly calculated execution. I stood up, clutching the photograph tightly against my chest. My vision tunneled and my heartbeat steadied into a cold, rhythmic drum. I was going to tear my father's empire down to the concrete studs. I was going to hand his life over to the federal authorities and watch them lock him in a cage. And then I was going to fly to Oregon, walk into that bookstore, and finally bring my mother home. The massive mahogany doors of the Hastings Capital Holdings boardroom were firmly shut. Inside, my father was sitting at the head of a 50-foot table holding court. I stood in the glass hallway outside, watching him through the soundproof windows. Richard was smiling. It was the wide, arrogant smile of a man who believed he had just conquered the world. He was holding a stack of papers addressing his board of directors, his private equity partners, and my stepmother, Victoria, who was sitting proudly by his side. Harper was there too, looking smug and entirely vindicated. Julian had played his part flawlessly. Richard was currently delivering his victory speech. He was telling his board that Lumina was officially out of cash, that my supply chain was entirely dead, and that my company would file for absolute bankruptcy before the stock market closed at 4 o'clock. He was just moments away from signing a board motion to buy Lumina's remaining assets for absolute pennies on the dollar. He thought he had completely destroyed me. I did not knock. I placed both hands on the heavy brass handles and pushed the boardroom doors open with enough force that they slammed loudly against the interior walls. The sharp crack echoed through the massive room. Richard stopped talking mid-sentence. Every single head snapped toward the entrance. I did not walk in alone. I walked in flanked by a wall of absolute authority. On my right were 5 of the most ruthless corporate litigators from my legal team, each carrying thick leather briefcases. On my left and spilling into the room behind me were 12 federal agents. They wore dark suits and heavy tactical windbreakers. The bold yellow letters printed across their backs were completely unmistakable: FBI and SEC. The smug smile vanished from Richard's face so fast it looked like it had been violently ripped away. The color drained from his cheeks. Victoria dropped her expensive pen, letting it roll off the polished table and clatter onto the floor. Harper physically shrank back into her leather chair, her eyes wide with sudden terror. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard roared. He slammed his hands onto the table and stood up, trying to project his usual dominance. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "Get security up here right now. This is a private corporate meeting. You are trespassing on my property, Chloe." I walked slowly toward the center of the room. The federal agents fanned out, securing the exits and standing silently against the wood-paneled walls. Their presence was heavy, suffocating, and entirely lethal to a man who had built his life on financial lies. "This is not your property anymore, Richard," I said. My voice was calm, steady, and amplified by the absolute silence of the terrified board members. "You are standing in a building owned by a company that you no longer control." Richard let out a harsh, barking laugh, though his eyes were darting nervously toward the federal agents standing by the doors. "You are completely insane," he snapped, waving the papers in his hand. "You are bankrupt, Chloe. You are out of cash. Your little health platform is dead. I have the financial reports right here." I stopped at the edge of the table and looked directly into his eyes. "You have a fabricated financial report generated by a double agent who has been taking orders from me since Monday morning," I replied. I watched the realization slowly dawn on his face. "Lumina never lost its funding. We never ran out of liquid capital. I fed you a lie to make you overextend your credit lines. I needed you to mortgage your estate. I needed you to drain your holding accounts. Because while you were busy buying up my supply chain with money you did not actually have, I was busy buying you." I reached out and took a heavy document folder from my lead attorney. I tossed it onto the mahogany table right in front of Richard. It landed with a heavy, final thud. "That is a finalized hostile takeover execution," I stated clearly, making sure every single board member heard my words. $50 million in liquid cash transferred through Veronica Holdings, deployed directly to buy up all of your toxic, over-leveraged debt. The Federal Securities and Exchange Commission approved the transfer 20 minutes ago. As of right now, I am the majority owner of Hastings Capital Holdings. I own this building. I own your private equity firm. And I own the mortgage on your family house. You are completely broke, Richard." Richard stared at this heavy document folder on the table. In a typical family drama, this would be the moment I yelled that he was fired. I would tell him to pack a cardboard box and leave. The audience always expects a screaming match, a dramatic exit, and a neat corporate victory. But the reality of high-stakes American finance is brutally different. White-collar crimes are not resolved with angry family arguments. They are resolved with federal indictments. Losing the company was not the punishment. It was just the opening act. I stepped back and allowed the lead federal agent to move forward. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming through the vents. Richard looked from me to the agents, his chest heaving as he struggled to draw a breath. "You think you can just buy my company and kick me out?" Richard sneered, though his voice was shaking uncontrollably. "I will tie you up in civil litigation for the next 10 years. I will bleed you dry in court, Chloe. You have absolutely no grounds to remove me." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I reached into my second briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of bank records. "We are not going to civil court," Richard, I said evenly. I placed the bank records gently on the table next to the takeover documents. "That is the first strike. The hostile takeover executed with Veronica and her $50 million leaves you with absolutely zero equity. You are completely wiped out. You do not even have enough liquid cash to pay a parking ticket, let alone a retainer for a corporate defense lawyer. I own your desk. I own your chair. You are walking out of here with nothing but the clothes on your back." Richard opened his mouth to yell, but I immediately cut him off by dropping a second folder onto the table. It was stamped with the logo of his primary commercial lender. "Strike 2, I continued, my tone flat and clinical. "Those are the loan origination files you submitted to the federal bank yesterday. You claimed your commercial properties were fully leased. You inflated your holding assets by 300% to secure the emergency cash to attack Lumina. Submitting fraudulent valuations to a federally insured bank across state lines is wire fraud. It is tax evasion. It is a massive federal felony. The agents standing behind you are not here to act as security guards. They are here to execute a federal arrest warrant." A collective gasp rippled down the length of the long mahogany table. Several board members immediately pushed their chairs back and stood up, physically distancing themselves from Richard, so the FBI would not consider them co-conspirators. Victoria buried her face in her hands and began sobbing loudly. Harper sat completely frozen, staring at the federal agents in sheer horror. Richard looked like he was having a heart attack. His arrogant posture collapsed entirely. He leaned heavily against the table, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He looked at the bank documents, then looked up at me with wild, terrified eyes. "Who gave you those files?" he demanded, his voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. "Those were locked in my private vault." I did not smile. I did not gloat. I just reached into my bag one last time and pulled out the old yellowing leather portfolio that Marcus had handed me in the underground parking garage. The leather was cracked and worn, but it held the heaviest weight of all. I dropped it right in front of him. "And here is strike 3, I whispered, leaning in close so he could hear every single word. "This one is not for the Securities and Exchange Commission. This one is for the criminal prosecutors." Richard stared at this leather portfolio. He recognized it instantly. I watched his eyes widen in absolute terror as the final piece of his empire shattered into dust. 25 years ago, you forged my mother's signature on a series of power of attorney documents," I said, making sure my voice carried across the dead quiet room. "You bribed medical professionals to lock her in a psychiatric ward so you could steal her generational trust fund. You built this entire empire on stolen money. You thought you buried the evidence, but your own lead counsel Marcus handed it directly to me to save his own skin. He traded your life for his freedom." Richard stumbled backward. His knees hit his leather chair, and he collapsed into it, gasping for air. The invincible billionaire predator was completely gone. In his place was just a terrified, broken old man who had finally run out of lies. The lead FBI agent stepped forward and pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. "Richard Hastings," the agent said, his voice deep and entirely devoid of sympathy. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, tax evasion, and financial extortion. Stand up and place your hands behind your back." Richard did not fight. He did not scream. He just slowly stood up and put his hands behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed perfectly in the silent boardroom. It was the best sound I had ever heard in my entire life. The heavy steel of the handcuffs clicked shut, locking my father's wrists together behind his back. The sound was incredibly sharp in the silent boardroom. It was the absolute end of his reign. Victoria finally snapped out of her paralyzed shock. She jumped out of her chair, her expensive pearl necklace rattling against her chest. She started screaming frantically, her shrill voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "Marcus!" she shrieked, looking frantically around the room and out toward the glass hallway. "Where is Marcus? Call my son-in-law right now. He is our lead counsel. Do not say another word. Richard Marcus will fix this." I turned my head and looked through the soundproof glass walls of the boardroom. Marcus was standing out in the main corridor. He had not run away. He wanted to stay and watch the monster fall, just to make sure he was truly safe. Victoria slammed her hands against the glass, screaming for him to come inside and invoke attorney-client privilege. But Marcus did not move. He stood perfectly still, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He looked at his hysterical mother-in-law with absolutely zero sympathy. He reached into his tailored suit jacket, pulled out his cell phone, and deliberately powered it down right in front of her. He placed the dead phone back into his pocket and took a step backward into the shadows of the hallway. He was securing his own immunity. In the American legal system, a lawyer cannot protect a client when the lawyer is the one who handed the murder weapon to the prosecution. Harper completely unraveled. The glossy, untouchable facade of the Golden Child chief executive officer vanished in an instant. She slumped over the massive conference table, burying her face in her arms, and began to sob uncontrollably. Her designer makeup smeared across her tear-stained cheeks. She had spent her entire life believing she was superior because Richard handed her the keys to his kingdom. Now she realized she was just a puppet sitting in a burning house completely exposed to the federal fallout. She looked up at me, her eyes red and pleading. "Chloe, please!" Harper choked out, her voice breaking into a pathetic whine. "We are your family. Please stop this. Tell them to let him go. We can give you whatever you want." I looked down at the weeping woman who had mocked my salary and called me useless just a few days ago at the Christmas dinner table. There was no cinematic reconciliation. I did not feel a sudden wave of sisterly pity. I did not offer her a warm hug or a tearful speech about forgiveness. That kind of toxic forgiveness only exists in cheap television shows. In the real world, forgiveness does not erase a federal indictment. "I am not the one taking him away." "Harper," I replied, my voice completely stripped of any emotion. "The Department of Justice is taking him away. You cannot buy your way out of a federal wire fraud charge. You cannot negotiate with the FBI. You all played a dangerous game with stolen money, and you finally lost. It is entirely out of my hands now. I turned my back on my sister and my stepmother. I watched without a single ounce of regret as the federal agents firmly grabbed my father by his arms. They read him his Miranda rights, their flat, authoritative voices echoing over Victoria's hysterical screaming. They marched Richard Hastings out of his own boardroom, parading him in handcuffs, past his stunned employees, past his silent board of directors, and straight out into the cold reality of the criminal justice system. He was finally exactly where he belonged. I did not stay in New York to watch the media circus unfold. I let my legal team handle the press conferences, the asset liquidations, and the massive corporate transition. I walked out of that glass building, got into my car, and drove straight to the airport. I boarded a flight to Oregon, rented a car, and drove 3 hours deep into the quiet, rain-soaked suburbs. The town was incredibly small and remote. It was the kind of place where people went when they wanted to completely disappear from the world. I followed the coordinates from the old private investigator report until my navigation system led me down a narrow dirt road surrounded by towering, dense pine trees. At the very end of the path sat a modest, weathered wooden cabin with a small wraparound porch. It was perfectly quiet, save for the soft sound of the rain hitting the metal roof. I turned off the engine and sat in the driver's seat for a long time. For 10 years, I had built an impenetrable suit of corporate armor. I had faced down hostile boards, ruthless venture capitalists, and a father who tried to destroy my sanity. But walking up those 3 wooden steps felt like the most terrifying thing I had ever done. I stepped out of the car into the cold drizzle. My expensive tailored suit felt entirely out of place in the quiet woods. I walked up to the heavy wooden door, raised my trembling hand, and knocked twice. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then a heavy deadbolt clicked. The door slowly creaked open. An older woman stood in the doorway. She was wearing a faded knitted sweater. Her hair was completely silver, and deep lines of exhaustion were etched into her face. She looked exactly like a woman who had spent 2.5 decades looking over her shoulder, terrified of every single shadow. But as her eyes moved from my coat up to my face, time completely stopped. I saw the exact moment the lingering fear in her eyes was replaced by absolute paralyzing shock. The ceramic coffee mug in her hand slipped through her fingers. It shattered against the wooden floorboards, splashing dark liquid across our shoes. Neither of us even looked down. We did not scream. We did not cry out or collapse into dramatic, tearful monologues about the past. The pain of 25 years of forced separation was too vast, too impossibly deep for any human words to adequately capture. Instead, she took one trembling step forward. I closed the distance and wrapped my arms tightly around her. She felt so small, so incredibly fragile against me. She buried her face into my shoulder, her hands desperately gripping the fabric of my coat, as if she was terrified I would vanish into thin air. I closed my eyes, burying my face in her silver hair. The cold, ruthless chief executive officer completely dissolved into the rain, leaving only a daughter holding her mother for the very first time in 25 years. I held her tight, feeling the agonizing weight of our past finally lift off my shoulders. I leaned down, pressing my cheek against hers, and whispered the only words that actually mattered. "We got it back, Mom. We finally got it back. My name is Chloe Hastings. Today, Forbes magazine lists my net worth at $86 million. But the money is not the victory. The victory is that I took back my name, I took back my mother, and I took back my future from the people who tried to bury us in the dark. If you are listening to this right now, I want you to remember something very carefully. When toxic family members, manipulative partners, or ruthless bosses call you useless, they are not telling you the truth. They are telling you their strategy. They tear you down and try to keep you small because they are absolutely terrified of what you could accomplish if you ever realized your own true power. They want you to believe you are weak, so you never try to fight back. Do not waste your time plotting petty emotional revenge. Do not let their hatred infect your heart and turn you into a monster just like them. The ultimate revenge is not screaming at them across a holiday dinner table. The ultimate revenge is massive, undeniable success. It is building an empire so tall and so strong that their toxic words cannot even reach you anymore. Let your achievements be the hammer that shatters their lies. So I have one final question for you. Are you going to keep reading the lines they handed you, or are you finally ready to tear up the script that someone else wrote for your life? Let me know your answer in the comments below. Share your story if you have ever had to walk away from toxic people to build your own success. And if this journey gave you the strength to stand up and fight for your own future, hit the subscribe button. It is time to stop apologizing for your ambition. It is time to start building your own empire. Thank you for listening.